The rain had started just as Ethan left the office. It wasn't heavy, just enough to make the streets glisten beneath the pale city lights. He pulled his coat tighter and quickened his steps toward the underground station. The day had been long, his thoughts longer, filled with the same dull ache that had followed him for months now. Home waited, but not in the way it used to. Michael would be there, his husband of 7 years, but lately their conversations had become mechanical, routine exchanges about bills, work schedules, and groceries. They slept beside each other like polite strangers, separated not by distance but by silence. Ethan paused outside a small cafe near the station. It had become his quiet refuge on nights when the thought of returning home too soon felt unbearable. The familiar smell of coffee and baked bread wrapped around him as he stepped inside. He found a corner table, ordered his usual black coffee, and let the hum of conversation fill the spaces in his mind. That he was scrolling absently through his phone when he noticed him, the older man sitting by the window, reading a worn book of poetry. There was something about his composure that drew attention, a quiet dignity that didn't ask for it. The man's silver hair glinted beneath the soft cafe light, and the lines on his face looked carved by both time and tenderness. Their eyes met briefly when the man looked up, and Ethan offered a polite nod before returning to his cup. Moments later, a voice, warm and steady, broke through the ambient noise. "Evening," the man said, his accent refined but gentle. "I couldn't help but notice your choice of solitude. Mind if I share it?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to strangers speaking to him like that anymore, with easy confidence, as if conversation were an art. Still, he gestured to the seat opposite. "Of course. Please." The man smiled. "And Saturday, Henry," he said, extending a hand. Ethan. Henry's handshake was firm but kind. They spoke casually at first, the rain, the city, the strange comfort of quiet places. Henry told him he was a retired literature professor, that he liked to read in cafes because you can watch 1,000 stories unfold without saying a word. Ethan found himself smiling, genuinely for the first time in days. "That's an interesting way to put it." Henry tilted his head. "And you? What story are you living?" Ethan hesitated before replying, "A complicated one." Henry chuckled softly. "Aren't they all?" They talked for nearly half an hour. Henry had a way of listening that made silence feel purposeful rather than awkward. When he spoke, his words carried a kind of grace, a calm that made Ethan forget the restless noise inside him. He wasn't flirting, not exactly. But there was warmth in his tone that reached beyond casual kindness. As Ethan glanced at the time, he realized how easily the minutes had slipped away. He began gathering his things, offering a polite smile. "I should head home." Henry nodded, closing his book. "Before you go, may I offer a small suggestion?" "Of course. Join me for dinner tomorrow," Henry said, almost offhandedly. "No expectations, no pretense. Just good food and conversation. You look like someone who hasn't been truly listened to in a while." Ethan froze for a second. The invitation felt innocent, yet something in it stirred an unfamiliar pulse beneath his ribs. "That's kind," he said carefully, "but I'm married." Henry's eyes softened. "Then consider it dinner with a friend. Marriage doesn't forbid companionship, does it?" Ethan wanted to laugh, to say no, but the question lingered too close to something true. He gave a faint nod. "All right. Just dinner." When they parted, Ethan walked out into the misty night, the city shimmering like a half-remembered dream. He felt lighter and heavier all at once. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Michael, "Working late again?" "Don't wait up." Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment, his reflection staring back from the wet glass of the shop window. Then, without quite knowing why, he smiled, small, uncertain, almost guilty. As he walked toward the station, the echo of Henry's voice followed him. "You look like someone who hasn't been truly listened to in a while." The words clung to him like the drizzle on his coat, soft, persistent, impossible to ignore. He told himself it was nothing. Just dinner. Just conversation. But even as he thought it, Ethan knew something inside him had already begun to shift, and by the time he reached home, that single thought, fragile, forbidden, quietly alive, refused to let go. Ethan arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early. He'd dressed without overthinking, dark jeans, a gray shirt, a navy coat, but now, under the soft golden lights of the small Italian place, he wondered if he'd tried too hard. He almost turned back twice before spotting Henry through the window, seated at a corner table, reading again. This time it wasn't poetry but a slim book with no visible title. Henry looked up as Ethan entered, his face lighting with quiet recognition. "You came," he said, standing to greet him with a faint smile. Ethan nodded, unsure why his chest felt tight. "You did say there'd be food." Henry chuckled, gesturing toward the empty chair. "And I keep my promises." They ordered wine, the house red, and something light from the menu. The place was intimate but not crowded, the low hum of conversation wrapped around them like a safety net. For the first few minutes, their words were simple, cautious, about work, art, and the absurd price of city life. Yet beneath each sentence, a pulse of tension moved, quiet but undeniable. Henry's presence was easy, grounded. He listened the way most people don't, without waiting to reply. When Ethan spoke about his design projects, Henry's eyes stayed on him, interested, attentive. "You see details most people miss," Henry observed. "That's both a blessing and a curse." Ethan smiled faintly. "Lately it feels more like a curse." "Because you notice what's fading?" Henry asked. Ethan's reply caught in his throat. He looked away, pretending to study the candle flickering between them. "Something like that." For a moment, neither spoke. The restaurant's warmth pressed softly around them, the air thick with scent, wine, garlic, rain-soaked wool. Then Henry leaned back, his tone gentle but probing. "You mentioned being married." Ethan hesitated. "Yes." "Happy?" The question landed with unexpected weight. Ethan looked up, ready to deflect, but Henry's expression was patient, not judging. He answered honestly, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. "We used to be. I think we still could be. But lately, it's like we're moving in separate directions and pretending it's the same road." Henry nodded slowly. "Love changes shape. Sometimes what we call comfort is just quiet distance." Ethan exhaled, his throat tightening. "I guess I've been afraid to admit that." Henry's smile was soft. "Admitting it is the first act of courage." They talked for hours, their conversation looping from literature to loss, from humor to confession. Henry told him about his late partner, Daniel, a man he'd loved for decades before illness took him away. His voice trembled once but steadied quickly. "The hardest part of grief," Henry said, "is not the silence they leave behind, but how it teaches you to speak again." Ethan felt something uncoil inside him. "That's beautiful," he murmured. Henry shook his head. "It's just true." When the plates were cleared and the wine nearly gone, their conversation fell into a gentle quiet. The space between them pulsed with meaning neither dared name. Ethan felt his heartbeat slow, heavy and deliberate. Henry's gaze met his, not asking, not assuming, just seeing. For a fleeting second, Ethan wondered what it would be like to reach across the table, to let his hand rest on Henry's. The thought startled him, not for what it implied, but for how natural it felt. He quickly looked away. Henry noticed but said nothing. Instead, he smiled faintly and asked, "Would you like me to walk you home?" Ethan shook his head. "No. I think I should walk alone tonight." "Of course," Henry said, his tone warm, unoffended. Then, quietly, "You don't owe anyone loneliness, Ethan." The words landed deep, unsettling something fragile within him. He paid for his share of dinner despite Henry's protest, thanked him for the evening, and stepped into the night. The air was cool, the city hushed. Streetlights shimmered against damp pavement as Ethan walked without direction. His phone buzzed again. "Michael, don't wait up." "I'm still at the office." Ethan didn't reply. He pocketed the phone and kept walking, the echo of Henry's words trailing him like a shadow. By the time he reached home, his thoughts were a restless storm. He found Michael asleep on the couch, still in work clothes, a half-finished email glowing on the laptop beside him. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching him, remembering the man he'd once couldn't wait to touch. He reached out, brushing a stray hair from Michael's forehead, then drew his hand back, afraid to wake him, or himself. He whispered into the quiet room, "I didn't cheat. Not with my body." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they weren't true. His heart, trembling and alive, had already crossed a line. Ethan woke the next morning with a heaviness that refused to lift. The memory of the dinner lingered, not as guilt exactly, but as something softer and more complicated. He could still hear Henry's voice, low and steady, echoing through his thoughts, "You don't owe anyone loneliness." Michael had already left for work. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee, the mug he'd used still half full on the counter. Ethan stared at it longer than necessary, wondering when small details like that had begun to feel like signs of absence rather than presence. The week that followed unfolded in quiet disarray. Ethan went through the motions, work, errands, polite exchanges, but his mind kept slipping back to Henry. The sound of his laughter, the unhurried patience in his eyes, the way he had seen Ethan not as someone broken, but as someone unfinished. It was both comforting and unbearable that he told himself not to return to the cafe. Yet by Thursday evening, his steps carried him there almost unconsciously. The place was half empty, the rain tapping lightly against the windows as it had that first night. And there, in the same corner by the window, sat Henry, reading again. Their eyes met across the room. Henry's smile was faint, knowing, but he didn't call Ethan over. He simply turned a page, giving him a choice. Ethan stood frozen for a moment before shaking his head, more to himself than to Henry. He ordered coffee to go and left. On the street outside, the rain caught in his hair, cool and cleansing. For the first time in days, he understood what Henry had given him wasn't temptation, it was clarity. That night, Ethan sat across from Michael at dinner. The silence between them felt as thick as the air before a storm. He hadn't planned to say anything, but the words came uninvited. "Do you ever feel like we've stopped really talking?" Ethan asked quietly. Michael looked up, startled. "Talking? We talk all the time." "Not about us," Ethan said. "About how we're actually doing." Michael's brow furrowed. "I thought we were fine. Aren't we?" Ethan smiled faintly. "That's the problem. I don't know." The conversation that followed wasn't graceful. There were awkward pauses, defensive remarks, and moments where neither knew what to say. But beneath all of it, something honest stirred, a small crack in the wall they'd built between them. Michael admitted he'd been exhausted, consumed by work, unsure how to reach Ethan anymore. Ethan confessed that he'd felt invisible, unsure whether Michael still saw him at all. There were no tears, no grand reconciliation, just two men sitting at a table, finally acknowledging what had quietly unraveled between them. When the dishes were cleared, Michael reached across the table, hesitant. His hand rested over Ethan's for the first time in months. "I don't want us to fade," he said softly. Ethan met his gaze. "Then let's stop pretending we're fine." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. Later that night, after Michael had gone to bed, Ethan sat by the window and typed a short message on his phone. "Thank you, for reminding me what it feels like to be seen." He hesitated, then sent it to Henry. The reply came hours later, just a single line. "Then take that feeling home." Ethan stared at the message, a lump forming in his throat. He deleted the conversation, not out of denial, but as an act of quiet closure. In the days that followed, he tried to be more present, with Michael, with himself. It wasn't simple. Healing rarely was. But something inside him had shifted. The hunger that once felt like betrayal now became a reminder of what still needed tending. One evening, as they watched a film together, Michael leaned his head on Ethan's shoulder. The gesture was small, almost shy, but it filled the room with something real again. Ethan exhaled, letting the warmth of that moment settle over him like light through rain. He thought briefly of Henry, of his calm smile, of the strange kindness that had changed everything without claiming anything. That in a quiet voice, barely audible even to himself, Ethan whispered, "You didn't save me. You just reminded me I still could be." Outside, the rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered across the glass, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel the need to look away. The story wasn't over, not the marriage, not the man, not the quiet redemption unfolding inside him. It was simply beginning again. Morning light spilled across the kitchen table, soft and golden, yet Ethan felt as though the sun itself carried judgment. He sat with a mug of coffee cradled in his hands, staring at the rising steam, while Daniel hummed absently over the stove. The scent of frying bacon should have been comforting, familiar, yet every note of domesticity grated against Ethan's nerves. The memory of Caleb's kiss lingered like smoke in his lungs, unshakable, invasive. Daniel turned, plates in hand, smiling as if nothing in the world had shifted. "You were quiet last night," he said lightly, setting breakfast before them. "The dance must have worn you out." Ethan forced a chuckle, his throat dry. "Yeah. Just tired." It was a small lie, but it carried the weight of betrayal. Daniel accepted it without question, his faith so unwavering it nearly broke Ethan. He wanted to confess, to tear the guilt from his chest and lay it bare. But fear silenced him, fear of Daniel's heartbreak, of his own shame, of admitting aloud that desire had carried him somewhere he couldn't return from. All morning, Ethan moved through routine like a ghost. Daniel chatted about work, neighbors, the errands they needed to run, while Ethan's mind wandered back to Caleb's steady eyes and the dangerous calm with which he had let Ethan walk away. Caleb hadn't demanded anything. That restraint made him more haunting still. Later that day, while stacking hay in the shed, Ethan heard footsteps approach. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. Caleb's presence was a tide you felt before it broke the shore. "Thought you might be out here," Caleb said, leaning against the doorframe with casual ease. Ethan's heart lurched. "You shouldn't be here." Caleb shrugged. "Place looked quiet. Just wanted to check in." His tone carried no apology, only a steady confidence that unsettled Ethan more than any boldness could have. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, refusing to meet Caleb's gaze. "Last night was a mistake." "Maybe," Caleb allowed. "But did it feel like one?" The question landed hard, sharper than a blade. Ethan had no answer, because the truth trembled inside him. It hadn't felt like a mistake at all, it had felt like freedom, like a part of himself he had long buried had finally been unearthed. And that truth terrified him. "I love Daniel," Ethan whispered, as though saying it aloud might shield him. Caleb stepped closer, boots crunching on straw. "I don't doubt that. But loving him doesn't mean you stop being human. Doesn't mean you stop wanting more." Ethan's chest tightened, torn between anger and longing. He hated how easily Caleb voiced the thoughts he couldn't. He hated, too, how much he needed to hear them. Before Ethan could respond, Daniel's voice carried from the yard, calling his name. Panic shot through him. He stepped back from Caleb, heart pounding. "You should go," Ethan hissed. Caleb gave a slow nod, lips curving into that knowing half-smile. "I'll see you around." With that, he slipped away, leaving Ethan rattled and raw. When Daniel appeared moments later, Ethan forced composure. Daniel carried a gentle grin, oblivious, asking about supper plans as if the world were perfectly whole. Ethan answered with practiced ease, his smile brittle but convincing enough, yet beneath the surface, the fracture widened. Every ordinary kindness from Daniel became a reminder of the lie Ethan carried. Every laugh, every touch, every word of trust pressed heavier against his conscience. And Caleb's absence felt like presence, the echo of temptation whispering at the edge of every thought. That night, as Daniel slept beside him, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling, the silence unbearable. He replayed the barn dance, the kiss, the look in Caleb's eyes. He replayed Daniel's laughter at breakfast, the softness of his hand resting unconsciously against Ethan's arm. He lived in two worlds now, one of comfort and loyalty, the other of hunger and danger, and though he had chosen Daniel in the daylight, Ethan knew the choice was far from over. Desire didn't vanish simply because you denied it. It waited, Patient as a wolf at the tree line, Ethan closed his eyes, heart aching, knowing the story of last night was only the beginning.